I think you're going to realize that this crisis is one of the biggest learning experiences of your lives for all of us. We're all learning. So what I'm going to do is spend a little bit of time on what I believe are the transformational impacts in the way we think of human capital that are happening before our very eyes in real time, I would add. So as Yvette said, I've been studying HR and training and topics in the area of workforce for about 21 years. And we just had, and was beginning to see the stress in the 11 or 12 year economic cycle we were in. I'm in my 60s, so I've been through 4 or 5 of these cycles. This one's particularly interesting and different. But we were, as of January, we were talking about the tight labor market, the low unemployment rate, the rapid automation of jobs, the future of work, the fourth industrial revolution, the employee experience. We were talking about well-being as a product, sort of as a retention and engagement tool, not as a lifeblood of work. And then all of a sudden, this happened. And within almost a week, or maybe a little bit less, we started to change the entire framing of the future of work, and all of the things that we were worried about at the peak of the economic cycle seemed a little old. And from my perspective, I would agree with Yvette. I sensed an enormous amount of workplace anxiety before this happened. Standards of living were not keeping up with inflation. We had a lot of issues discussing income inequality. People not being sure if they were going to keep up with the digital skills that they needed. So you could sense, and CEOs were saying this, that we probably were going to have an economic slowdown, but we couldn't have predicted this one. I mean, this one definitely was a surprise. So what have we learned from this? Let me mention a couple things about what's going on among employees. By the way, I've probably had 60 or 70 conversations with CHROs and HR teams over the last 2 or 3 months. So I do have a lot of stories, but let me give you some data from some pulse surveys we're doing. As of 2 weeks ago, the #1 concern amongst the workforce was job security. People were very concerned about their employer, their jobs, and their particular incomes. And of course, their personal health and safety, and then all the issues around family and kids at home, out of school, and beginning to become more and more concerned about work-life balance. As of this week, it's changed. Now people are really worried about operating in the world they're in, which is for many people, 60 to 70% of the US working from home. Not everybody's working at home, but a high significant are. By the way, an interesting thing that I found from the work at home trend was that more than 50% of companies didn't even have a remote work policy. So a lot of banks and insurance companies and regulated industries had to quickly create one, which they did, and have been dealing with issues of how do I get people technology, how do I create better workplaces at home, how do I create an ongoing communication process with people, how do we keep people engaged and productive at home. I mean, we don't have to commute, but now we have to actually deal with our kids or our dogs or our families, or maybe the fact that our house is not designed for working at home. And the issues of social resilience and personal resilience and sustainability have come up. And to give you a piece of information on this, people are actually working harder now than they were before. MetLife just did a study last week, and about 2,000 or so people responded. And the #1 concern on employees' minds was, quote, "I am tired." People are tired of video calls, emails, things going on in the office that they can't keep up with. And obviously they're tired of the fact that they can't get the food they want or see their friends and families and take care of their own personal lives well either. On the HR side, I would say what's been inspiring to me, for those of you that are either in HR or entering HR, this has been really a heroic moment. This is a crisis where HR is really the heroes. I think the last crisis, the financial community and the banks and the federal government was the heroes. I think right now it's HR coupled with facilities and safety and IT that's really driving this. And amongst the biggest issues have been the human issues that Yvette was just talking about. In fact, one of the things, I'll show you some research on this in a minute, is that many HR people have told me that overnight, our culture changed in our company. Overnight, we became transparent. Overnight, we became more caring. Overnight, we started to think about human needs and health and workplace and personal needs amongst employees, whereas we were kind of paying it lip service before this. So, so this has been a, sort of in some sense, a positive change. And we just did a crowdsourced, we have this website called covidhrpulse.com where people are crowdsourcing their comments, and you can see support, patience, recognition, humor, transparency, messages from the senior executives every day, every couple of days. Those are positive things for culture in the workforce. So even though there's an enormous amount of stress with, something like 30 million people being out of work, the people that are affiliated with employers are basically saying, you know what, my employer is doing the best they can and they're taking care of me and I'm feeling good about it. And these are all the things they're doing. The interesting thing as I talk to companies about this stuff is they have done this very, very fast. One of the problems in the human capital space inside of big companies is this need to be agile. And there have been, interminable conversations and articles and discussions about how to become more agile in HR. And all of a sudden, HR suddenly got agile. Most of the companies I talked to told me that they did things over the weekend that they would have taken 3 months to do prior to the crisis. New onboarding programs, new training programs, enablement tools, protocols for safety are being invented in almost real time. And so we're kind of learning that we can move fast. But the other thing that we're learning in the HR profession is that we have to be coordinated. I'm going to talk about this for a second. One of the things, and I'm sure Peter has some great things to share with us from his research, one of the big challenges in the HR profession is how do we operate in an efficient, service-oriented way, but also act locally to respond to local needs. Well, this virus is very local. It behaves differently in every city, in every community. The laws keep changing in different communities. Around the world, we have some parts of the world that are back at work, some parts of the world that are not ready to be back at work. Every day there's a new press release from the president that gets us going in another direction. And so we need this ability to communicate. And what I've done over the last couple of months is study up on all this. And I want to take just a couple minutes and talk about this idea of command and control in human capital. And this comes from the military. And I did a lot of research on this during the 2008 recession. And what you find when you look at the military is, they've been studying asymmetric threats a lot over the last 10 years. And they believe that there are going to be more frequent, violent, asymmetric threats in the military sphere, which there are. I think you would also conclude that's exactly what's happening in business, is that this crisis, as bad as it is, and life, it's sort of a once in a lifetime thing, may not be a once in a lifetime thing. We actually have these kinds of threats more frequently than you realize in companies. For me personally, I was thinking about it. I got laid off in 2001 from the 2000.com thing. We had a fire and had to leave our home and completely disrupt my family in the mid 2000s out here in California. We've had an earthquake. We've had 9/11, obviously, the Iraq War. We've had Brexit. Wells Fargo's had a financial crisis. Boeing's going through a crisis. Every time there's a cybersecurity leak, it's a crisis. And now we have the coronavirus crisis. This is more frequent than you realize. And so we have to think about human capital strategies in HR departments as being resilient in themselves and creating resiliency for these kinds of events. In fact, even Bill Gates made an interesting comment last weekend. He believes this pandemic is a warm-up for more pandemics. And, I don't think he has any reason to scare us, but I believe him. I mean, the coronavirus is mutating, and there will be other viruses probably in our lifetime. So it leads you to believe, and by the way, this was a funny thing. I found this piece of research from Accenture that's 2 years old, where they were basically saying the same thing, but nobody was paying attention because we were so excited about the stock market and the job market. So one of the things we have to take away as a learning experience from this situation that we're in is how do we design human capital strategies to not only be efficient and responsive, but to also be resilient and adaptive. And if you go back to the military's been doing this and they've figured this out. And what the military basically found is that in the world of asymmetric threats of the military type, there are a bunch of things to do. One is to create what they call a socio-technical system. And if you get under the covers of what that means, what they're basically saying is we need systems and data and platforms and communications, but we also need human beings that have relationships with each other. So relative to HR, one of the things I've been, sort of helping HR departments do is make sure they have a lot of human connections so that when something happens, you know who to call, you have a relationship with that person, and you have a sense of trust. They also find, like in the third bullet, that skills and training are central to success. As one of the admirals in the Navy said to me, he was my boss for a while, he said, basically in the military, we only do two things. We fight and we train. And when we're not fighting, we're training. And in some sense, that's a little bit of a message for us in HR. And one of the reasons I got into the professional development business myself is I really think we have a lot of continuous learning to do in HR as HR professionals, as human capital leaders. And all of you obviously on this video understand that. This issue of being able to deal with ad hoc partners, ad hoc situations. Companies are lending their workers to other companies, for example. There are talent marketplaces that have grown up out of this crisis where companies are saying, I'll pay your benefits and I'll introduce you to this other company that's hiring so you can go work for them for a while and then come back and work for us when this is over. In fact, one of the advertising agencies told me they're so worried about losing their best people because the ad business has dropped. They're basically telling their people, we would like you to go work for one of our competitors for a little while if you can find a job and then come back to us afterwards. That's ad hoc stuff that people hadn't thought about before this. And then at the bottom, there's this obvious need for innovation and creativity, which is really what we're living in is a world of invention. Nobody really knows how to respond to this until they've done it. And then this need for shared awareness and data. And for those of you in the program, you know that analytics and data are a huge part of HR now, a mandatory part of HR. So that's now become sort of instrumental. So the reason I show you this is because when I was reading through all these things, I realized they all apply to HR. I mean, we can almost take all these military command strategy books and say, hey, that's about, what we do here in our organizations too. So that's been an interesting learning experience. The next topic I want to talk briefly about is resilience, because that's, kind of the theme. And I'll just give you a couple thoughts there. I mean, I think from what I've seen in my life and my career, human beings are incredibly resilient. Individuals in our lives, we adapt to a lot of things. You have an accident, you hurt yourself, you have a crisis at home, you have a work problem, you usually deal with it. We are relatively good at this. Now I had a good, interesting call with Martin Seligman last week, who's a very famous psychologist, and he did a lot of work with the Army, and he found that the 5% of soldiers who suffer from PTSD have certain problems. One of the problems is they don't have an optimistic point of view about life. So optimism is part of resilience. And having fun is part of resilience, which we have to do more of. But generally, we're pretty resilient. But what isn't resilient is organizations. And so one of the things that I would encourage you to think about in your curriculum and in your studies is how can you create practices in HR, in human capital, that can adapt? Because a lot of the things that we do, the operating models, the performance management systems, are sort of designed for a certain business cycle. And then when the business cycle changes, we're like, that's not working anymore. So there's a lot of learning going on in companies about how to adapt. For example, a lot of companies are stopping their performance management process immediately and changing it to adapt to the situation they're in because the business plans, of course, are out of date. And I think this is going to continue for a while. I mean, it's interesting if you read up on the pandemic, I'm sure a lot of you are, there's a lot of research that's pointing out that this virus, we don't really understand it yet. And so a lot of the things we need to do to respond to it, we don't know. So I think we're in the middle of what I call a big reset. And it's a reset of many things. It's a reset of how we work. It's a reset of how we spend our money. It's a reset of how leaders behave. It's a reset of how we listen to people and deliver competent solutions. And it's a reset of our role. And I think for those of you in HR and those of you moving into HR, this is a heroic period of time where HR is going to emerge as an even more important part of companies than before this all happened. Now, in terms of the next step, let me just spend 2 or 3 minutes on this and I'll turn it back over to the host. In all of my conversations with companies, there's basically 3 things going on. There's this reaction to, oh my God, what happened? Who's affected? Get the data and deal with it immediately. Then there's the response, which has been largely around remote work, policies for safety, identifying the people that are at risk, helping people with home situations and personal life, being fair, that some people will not be able to work as hard as others. There's a funny conversation I had, Microsoft had a new policy they just introduced to allow people with children at home to take 8 weeks sabbatical or 8 weeks paid break. And somebody said, that's not fair. I don't have kids at home. How come I don't get that? And I'm thinking, boy, that's a really interesting conversation to have. So these are the kinds of things that are coming up. And then the third thing that's starting to happen that I think is the most mysterious of all, but we're going to have to figure it out, is how do we go back to work in some new form? It won't be the same. And I would say that what I've learned, and certainly I'm not the expert on this yet, but I'm learning as fast as I can, is we're not going to go back to work in the same way. Not only will the office change, the work environment will change, we'll have a different kind of cafeteria, the elevators will be different, the desks will be different. We're not going to be crammed into offices right next to each other the way we were anymore. There'll be policies for how to have meetings, but the way we go to market is going to change. Hospitals are basically saying, I don't know if you know this, but hospitals are suffering from a lack of demand because people don't want to go to the hospital. So they're staying home and they're sick. And so digital health is exploding. One of the hospital systems I talked to told me that their digital health service has grown by 2 orders of magnitude in the last 60 days. And so they're training all of their medical professionals to do digital health. Same thing's happening in banking. That the transportation industry will change. So all of these things are going to affect human capital because people are going to move into new roles and they're going to do it because it's going to be the new company. And so let me just conclude with that and I'll turn it back over to the panel. I think the biggest lesson that I'm taking away from this pandemic, in addition to the need for a focus on the human part of work, which I couldn't agree with you more, that that this is a focus on the human beings, is that we are now going through a business transformation. We thought the digital transformation of the last 10 years was a big deal. Well, now we just accelerated it by a sort of 2 orders of magnitude. Transforming the businesses we're in, the roles, the workplace. We are now bonding together IT, HR, safety, and facilities into one integrated team. We're going to find ways of empowering people to work in a more distant and remote fashion. We're probably going to have more drones and electronic devices and robots at work. That was already starting. Now that'll happen faster. But I think the most positive of all this is that at the center of it all, what companies are learning, and I don't know that the political system is learning this, but I think companies are learning, is that we don't have companies without people, and we don't have effective companies without people who feel safe, empowered, and supported. And from the research I'm seeing, and I'm very curious what the other people have to say on this panel, CEOs are getting this. They are, I sort of use this concept that the CEO is the chief empathy officer. That's really starting to happen. And so I think we're going to set in place a new kind of culture of work coming out of this that hopefully will be more people focused than ever before. So let me stop there and turn it back over to the host, and I'll be there for questions at the end.
Thank you, Josh. There's been a lot of interest in the topics that the landscapes that you laid out, and thank you for that. One observation and one question. So one of the sentiments in the chat is that it's important for HR professionals, people managers to not be only internally focused, but to have their attention on the landscape. And so a lot of HR professionals struggle with being so removed from, and so so that was one, is that there was an aha that came from that. But the other was an aha around, often when we talk about inclusion, there's talk of whether it's political. The example that you gave around the military, there's a difference between the purpose of an organization that is devoted to the veterans and are going beyond just having numbers of them make up a good soundbite, versus the company that incorporates and engages their vets so that they can discover scenario building and some of the things that you mentioned, whether it be after action learning or some of the things that come from military. So part of a business's success and why it's important in getting your head around the unknown and organizing your thinking about what you know, it's not about bringing in people for politics. It broadens your capacity at times like this to tap into different levels. So thank you for that. The one question I have before we go on to the next segment is, how has your experience as a scholar and practitioner informed each other during the crisis? Because if you're not in a classroom or boardroom, how has that shaped how you think about the space?
Well, I'm not sure if I'm a scholar. I did a lot of scholarly stuff earlier in my career. I'm very pragmatic. My feeling about human capital is if it isn't working, you probably shouldn't be doing it. So as much as we want to have long-term strategies for planning and development and organizational design and innovation, we have to do that. Right now, I'm amazed at the inventiveness and creativity of the HR people I talk to. And I do think one of the fundamental changes in HR, for those of you that are studying the domain, is it is becoming an innovative part of business. You're going to be asked to invent things when you go to work in a big company. You're going to be asked to come up with new ideas that nobody's done before. And I'm seeing that all the time. And I think all this business about having a seat at the table, nobody's mentioning that anymore. HR people are at the table and they're being expected to, come up with creative ideas to this particular crisis. And I think the domain and the expertise that you guys have and that you deliver at Columbia is critical to doing this well.